Well, the way I look at it is this. You've traveled all day, you've had a good meal, and somebody wants to talk about history, right? This is doomed, but God is good, so who knows? Russ, I appreciate those words. I don't usually get that much respect, I have to tell you. I got a letter some time ago addressed to faculty member, Division of Religion, Southern Wesleyan University, but they left the C out of faculty. That's right, I'm a faulty member of the Division of Religion, and that explains a lot. Once I realized that I was, it explains a student who said to me one time, "I really like your course on suppository preaching." True story. Another one who wrote, a canonical requirement for the New Testament was that the books had to be written in the lifetime of their author. Somebody else said that at Pilate's Judgment Hall, the crowd chose Barbados. Yeah. But one of the most touching moments I've ever had is with a student who actually flunked out of school. And I went to him to express my hope that he didn't get too discouraged. And he said, "Prof, that's okay. It's not all your fault." So with those clear recommendations, I mean, how could this fail? Here it is.
If Bob leans to the left, it'll be a disaster.
Got it. Okay. Ordination in Wesleyan Tradition. It's risky to use the word tradition in the title. I know it is. I know some people check out when they hear that term. But we do have a tradition. We aren't just a rootless expression of generic evangelicalism. We have not only the universal tradition of the Christian church, what Jude called the faith once for all delivered to the saints, but within that larger legacy, we have the Wesleyan tradition, which has earned its place in the larger church, and respect even from those who are of different theological persuasions. We do have a tradition. It does have a history, and it speaks to us. So how has our tradition spoken on the issue of ordination, which is the topic that is before us in this conference? Let's start where Wesley started. Ordination was a major issue for Wesley, a major issue in Wesley's Methodism. He began, of course, as an Anglican and a Don of Oxford. He began in the matrix of the Church of England. He lived and died as an Anglican priest. He lived and died firm in the conviction that there was room for Methodism in the Anglican tradition. Methodism as a reforming element, but still within the Anglican tradition. Now, Anglicanism on the issue of ordination recognized a specialized ministry of word, sacrament, and order. That's the quote. Word, sacrament, and order. Jeffrey Bromley has used this formula in several of his works, and his take on that is paraphrased as word, deed, and authority. He points out how Jesus employed each of those elements. Obviously, ministering through word with his teaching and his preaching, ministering through deed with his healing ministry, with his cleansing of the temple, with his institution of the Lord's Supper, ministering through authority as well. His willingness to say, "I know what the law says, but I say unto you." His willingness to forgive sins, cast out evil spirits, as demonstrations of his own authority. There's a cluster of miracles in the middle of the Gospels where in the space of just a few chapters, especially if you take it as a synthesis, you see Jesus exercising authority over sin, exercising authority over evil spirits, exercising authority over nature, and exercising authority over death. And so in those contexts, Jeffrey Bromley says we have the model in Jesus for a minister who is commissioned to serve in the areas of word, deed, and authority. Now, think back to your most recent ordination service in your district. Think back to the ritual in the Wesleyan discipline. Here's the quote: "Take authority to preach the word of God, to administer the holy sacraments, and to perform the duties," there's the authority, "of an ordained minister in the Wesleyan Church." Out of the Book of Common Prayer, through Wesley, that Anglican rite still has a home in our own tradition, in the ordination of ministers. So, with that expectation of a minister, Anglicanism viewed ordination as essential. That's the key to being able to exercise the ministries, full ministries of word, deed, and order or authority. Wesley was firmly convinced of that. Hal Harris says that Wesley told him one time that if he were not ordained, he would look on it as murder if he offered the ordinances to anyone, if he offered communion, for example. In less dramatic terms, Frank Baker says, Wesley never shook off his conviction that for the sake of decency and order, if not for validity and effectiveness, the Lord's Supper should be administered by a clergyman of the Church of England. Wesley said to his Methodist people, go to the Anglican Church on Sunday morning, take the sacrament there, and then come to the Methodist chapel Sunday evening. And the clear implication is to get everything else that you need. So Wesley did take ordination seriously. I think that's the place where we start. That's not to say that we're bound to follow Wesley to the letter on this any more than we are on anything else that we have inherited from our spiritual father. We're not bound to adopt his rejection of tea, for example, which he did consider to be worse than alcoholic beverages. We're not bound to his autocratic leadership style. We're not bound to his fascination with electric shock, which was new in Wesley's day, and he was totally fascinated by the opportunity. As tempted as we might be to administer it to certain people under our authority, we can't do that. But generations of those who are in that Wesleyan family have found value and meaning in Wesley's own appreciation for ordination and the fact that he did take it seriously and insisted on standards related to it. But in part, that's compatible with the different aspects of his tradition today, different forms that it takes in different denominations, because point number two is that Wesley himself was flexible and demonstrated that flexibility when the situation called for it. As much as he valued institutional order, and Wesley was in love with order, he could be remarkably flexible when the situation demanded it. If souls were at stake, ecclesiastical polity did not rule the day for Wesley. Now, that's an introductory statement. It's not my conclusion. So listen to what I mean by that. He was surprised when his superiors didn't look at it in the same way, when they had other priorities, when they were not willing to be as flexible as he. But the bottom line was, no, Wesley didn't view church orders as absolutely absolute. First example, Church of England recognized a threefold order of ministry in bishop, priest, and deacon. There was a footnote, basically, that allowed for lay preachers, lay ministers in the church. Wesley seized on the footnote, which was largely ignored across the Church of England in Wesley's day, and made it a pivotal point in his spread of Methodism in England and in America. to the great concern of the bishops who called him on the carpet for it. And Wesley said, it's in there. We have the right to use lay ministers. And they said, but not in the numbers that you're using them, and not in the authority that you're giving them. Not authority to administer sacraments, but authority to preach the word and authority to organize chapels. Wesley said, I'm simply using a creative application of a privilege that we already have in our polity. Second example, when the bishops refused to ordain ministers for America, and the American movement was in peril because of it, Wesley took it on himself to ordain ministers for his own work. That astounded the bishops, and it appalled his brother Charles, who said that he had completely gone overboard with this. But Wesley had read Lord Peter King. Wesley had read Edward Stillingfleet. They had convinced him that in the New Testament, elders and overseers were the same office. As in Acts, for example, when Paul met with the elders of the church at Ephesus, and they were later referred to as overseers. In the New Testament era, those were interchangeable terms. By Wesley's day, overseer had become bishop, elder had become priest, and they were differentiated. Wesley said, if it takes rocking the boat to get ministers for my American work, I'll revert to a New Testament pattern and ordain them myself, since I am an elder, a priest in the Church of England, and in New Testament terms should have the same rights that an overseer or a bishop has to ordain ministers. You can imagine how well that went over in the Church of England. And so on his own authority, he ordained Thomas Vasey and Richard Whitecoat to the ministry. He ordained Thomas Coke as superintendent of the American work. He didn't like the word consecrated, so he used ordained, even though Thomas Coke had already been ordained as a priest. He ordained him as a superintendent. That was Wesley's substitute term for bishop, by the way. And he instructed Coke to ordain Francis Asbury to the same office as American Methodism got its start. Those actions were unprecedented from a non-dissenting member of the Church of England. And Wesley's response was, I love the Church of England, but I do not love her so as to take her blemishes as ornament. He saw a need for flexibility which the church did not afford, but Wesley felt he had not transgressed the policy of the Church of England, he had only bent it a little. That there was in his use of lay preachers foundational provision made in the Church of England, just not in the way that he chose to use them. And in his appointment, in his ordination of ministers for America, made necessary because of the bishop's refusal to do it, Wesley said, I still believe I'm within my legal authority in my interpretation of the New Testament and the offices that it mentions there. Note that although this clearly was a rejection of Anglican practice, it was not absolutely a rejection of Anglican polity. Wesley didn't see what the Church of England was doing as bad ecclesiology so much as bad application of the ecclesiology that they had. And Wesley was determined to make good application as necessary. Now, if we fast forward to the rise of the Wesleyan Methodist Church and the Pilgrim Holiness Church, in our tradition, same thing holds. They did not see church orders as absolutely absolute when it came to mission-driven needs in the church. Example A is when the Wesleyan Methodists rejected episcopacy, or superintendency, as Wesley had defined it, prompted by the abuse of the Methodist leadership. of the day. Bud Bentz argues very effectively that there was also a strong strain there of American democratic principle being expressed, and that needs to be seen as well in Frederick Turner's frontier thesis about the rise of self-reliance and the importance of the individual in American life because of the frontier experience. So American heirs of Wesley in the Wesleyan Methodist Church found that an acceptable way to adapt to their conditions. On the Pilgrim side, under the banner of the Holiness Union, before they became the Pilgrim Church, before they became the International Apostolic Holiness Union, Holiness Church, while they were still what amounts to a parachurch group, Seth Reese and Martin Wells Knapp ordained Charles and Letty Kalman, who went on to found OMS as one of the most effective missions agencies of the 20th century. And they ordained them out of the context not of a denomination, at least not yet, but out of a holiness union that had a vision that would later express itself as a denomination. I think another example is the fact that Wesleyan Methodist ordained women a century before the Methodist Church did, a century before the Church of England did. Because, once again, there is that flexibility to say, we see what you think practice must be, but we see another way. Not in rejection of a principled polity, but in rejection of a faulty application or of a non-biblical understanding of an ecclesiastical polity. Now, in all of this, you won't find any Wesleyan Methodist or Pilgrim Holiness writers or thinkers saying we don't take ordination seriously, because they certainly did in every aspect. But it does prove that our tradition guides us, it doesn't bind us. There is flexibility. It releases us to adopt policies and procedures as long as principles aren't compromised. For mission-driven ministry. So, if we do have that freedom, historically, what does that look like in our context? If there is ample precedent for not viewing our tradition as sacrosanct, as set in stone as it is, not just in principle but in application, for being willing to modify it for the sake of the kingdom. In fact, if that flexibility itself is a part of our tradition, then to adapt and adjust to changing context within the parameters of those principles is a very Wesleyan thing to do. We have that kind of elbow room embedded in our DNA. But elbow room is one thing. What shall we say to ecclesiologies that are inconsistent with the principles behind our tradition, but ecclesiologies which vie for acceptance among us? Ecclesiologies whose sponsoring bodies outnumber us and influence society to a greater degree, perhaps, than we have, and so often seem attractive to many within our movement because of it. Well, what we shall say to them depends on how well we value the tradition that we come from, because they come from another. And this takes several different forms. One I've mentioned here is the idea that ordination itself is not important. The statement that I made in the paper says, when ordinands are told that the laying on of hands won't change a thing, that they'll be the same minister tomorrow that they are today. There is a germ of truth in that we are not coming to ordination from a Catholic point of view and considering it a sacrament. We certainly do not believe in the opus operatum view that it's automatic when the church pronounces it. On the other hand, it's a very dangerous thing to say. And I've heard it said. I've heard it said at Wesleyan ordination services. It's dangerous because it misses the biblical truth that the endorsement and affirmation of the church on the life of a person who feels the call of God to ministry is not just important, it's essential. I want to ask for a show of hands, but mine would be up. As one who has had to remind himself on more than one occasion that the church did at one time say, we do think we see the call of God on your life and in your ministry. Mondays can be very, very hard sometimes. And when you teach school, you get several Mondays every week sometimes that are hard to overcome. And so there is this essential note of encouragement for the affirmation of what can be a sense of God's call that's difficult to maintain in pressured situations. But the affirmation of the church has a date and a place and a moment that is embedded in the mind and heart and soul of the individual that says, no, there is validity in this. I'm not the only one who saw it. It's a biblical concept. There are at least close parallels to this in the passages on the laying on of hands in both 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, for example. To denigrate this is to risk devaluing the role of the church in ministry overall. And it seems to me is taking one more step toward a churchless Christianity that many would encourage us to seek, and I hope we never do, because that's an unbiblical concept. Another non-Wesleyan view would be denying of ordination to women. And of course the first response is, but we don't do that as Wesleyans. But the second response is, then why don't we place them and give them responsibilities for ministry? It doesn't stop with credentialing. That's supposed to be where it starts. And we have the opportunity to live up to what we say we believe in the ordination of women as we give them pastoral responsibilities. Still another would be laxity in the application of standards for ordination. I have been asked by an unnamed district superintendent to change a grade for a student because we need them to graduate, and we have a place for them already. So how about bending the academic standards so that we can make the church more secure? Something very wrong with that, I think. And it's not to say that that's a common attitude throughout the church. I don't believe it is. But it is a danger the church needs to be aware of and to watch out for. We have what I think are good common sense requirements that are not as elevated as those denominations that require seminary and even some more than that. And those, for example, that then have to pass a post-seminary test to achieve ordination on the one hand, and those for whom there are no requirements, basically, on the other. We've got a good, solid middle ground there. It doesn't need to be surrendered. Finally, what of adopting a more congregational view of church government with regard to the ordination at the hands of a local church? This comes close to one of the issues that we're going to be talking about this week. What about growing churches who have people within them who feel called to serve that local church but don't feel a call or have plans to serve the church at large beyond that local capacity? I don't think that means that we have to adopt a congregational view of polity that says each local church determines its own ordination policies and practices. But it can, I'm just speaking from a historical point of view, if we start with Wesley's love of ordination, but his flexibility in its application. We can find ways to accommodate that rising trend within the polity that we have if it's bent but not broken. If we use creative application of principles that we already have, we don't have to say no to new ideas and changing needs in the church just because it's never been done that way before. I think that violates the flexibility that our tradition has always enjoyed. In the Wesleyan holiness tradition, church orders are not more important than the mission of the church. But at the same time, we believe that the mission of the church is facilitated by those church orders. Our history proclaims it, and our experience confirms it. We are well equipped to adapt to changing times. We're well equipped to adapt to rising needs in the church with new approaches that don't sacrifice the principles that are embedded in the theology of our tradition. Thank you.
We're going to take a couple minutes. You might have a couple fresh questions that you'd like to ask Bob, and then we'll be breaking off into groups to process. So any questions? And there's a mic at your table. If you wouldn't mind picking that mic up and clicking it on and speaking into it. So what initial questions or thoughts are swirling, and the ones that you were a little later, you're going to be chewing on at your table. So any thoughts or questions?